I'm joined now by Mikhail Korokovsky, who was once Russia's richest man. In the early years of Putin's reign, Korokovsky became a prominent critic of the Kremlin before he was imprisoned for fraud and tax evasion, charges he says were politically motivated. He was released in 2013 and has been living outside Russia since then. Welcome, Mikhail Korokovsky. But before we begin, I want people to understand why I think you have real insight into how the Kremlin works. In 2003, you were the richest man in Russia. Brilliant businessman, you had run a whole bunch of businesses, and then you start criticizing the regime, and you say you may run against Putin for president. Within 6 months, your company has been taken away from you, the largest company in Russia. You are in prison, and you spent 10 years in prison. And the company is taken away through a complicated series of maneuvers where they claim tax fraud and stuff. So you know how Putin operates and who has power in that system. Is it possible that the oligarchs have enough power that they can pressure Putin to change course, to withdraw from Ukraine?
This is a mistake, a mistaken presumption about how Russian power is arranged. Russian power is not an oligarchy. It's a dictatorship. And the oligarchs are merely, actually, not oligarchs, but merely agents of the Kremlin who are used by the Kremlin as a tool. So there is no feedback in the other direction to influence the dictator. They cannot do that in practical sense.
What about the military or other parts of the ruling elite, maybe the KGB, what is now the FSB? Are the intelligence services or the army? Does anyone have power other than, Putin? He calls himself the vertical of power. Is there anybody outside of that vertical of power?
Most likely, it's not so much a vertical of power, it's Putin power. Putin holds on to power by taking parts of the people around him and setting them off against each other. Of course, there are people that do have some influence on his mental perceptions, people such as Yuri Kovalchuk and those people who are around Yuri Kovalchuk. And of course, the military can tell Putin, and they are indeed telling him now, that we, in current conditions, cannot do the task that we've been assigned. And Putin has to take that into account. But the decision is made by him, of course.
So what is the way to pressure Russia to get serious at the negotiating table?
Unfortunately, no other advice can be given here other than the courage of the Ukrainians and the sanctions that undercut the opportunities for Putin to buy new weapons and to hire mercenaries.
So only force. Putin will only understand if there is pressure, if there is resistance from Ukraine, if there are sanctions from the West.
Unfortunately, he's that kind of a person. All his life, he's always dealt with the criminal elements and was indeed himself part of that criminal world. He doesn't treat the law seriously, or state institutions for that matter. In his world, the main thing is force. And if you don't show him force, if he senses that you're weak, as he does, for example, about Mr. Macron, he simply takes advantage of you. When he feels force, when he's afraid of force, he's ready to talk.
A lot of people have criticized Joe Biden for saying that he wished Vladimir Putin were no longer in power. The argument is you have to negotiate with him. You're going to have to sign a deal with him. And so this would complicate things. How do you see it?
Я тоже много
I
критиковал.
have also done a lot of criticizing of Mr. Biden, but from a different perspective. I think that his words are absolutely correct and very important. First of all, they're important because people in the world, all over the world, are waiting, are expecting an ethical assessment from the leader of the free world. And when this leader gives this ethical assessment, that is important. His assessment that such people should not be in power. It's understandable that only the Kremlin and maybe the White House interpreted these words as Mr. Biden being ready to personally remove the Russian president. Everybody else understood it correctly. It was an ethical assessment. Russians are going to remove Russia's president. Another second important thing is that Mr. Putin perceives and this approach without the show of force as weakness. And so when Mr. Biden said that using weapons, that there's going to be an appropriate response to the use of weapons of mass destruction, that's not a provocation for Putin. That's something that puts brakes on his desires. And on the other hand, when Mr. Schultz or Mr. Macron says that there's no way that we should take part in a clash with Putin's forces, that actually encourages Putin to use weapons of mass destruction. This is a fundamental lack of understanding of the mentality of a person who has been among criminals all his life.
So Putin is now facing obstacles in Ukraine. Given what you know of his mentality, what is he going to do? Is he going to turn Ukraine into Chechnya, destroy it? Is he going to back away? What do you think his options are?
For
him, the situation today is very complicated. At first, what he wanted was to change the power in Kiev, put in his puppet, and was expecting that this would be met with flowers thrown in the streets by Ukrainian people. When this did not happen, he went crazy. The fact that the people in Kharkov did not meet him with flowers, it not only just angered him, I really think it drove him literally insane. That's when he started bombing Kharkiv and Kiev. Right now, he has three options that face him, 3 ways out. First way out is to continue pressuring Ukraine and probably losing troops in this process because the Ukrainians are fighting back ever more strongly with every day. Secondly, he could use weapons of mass destruction in the hope that this would force the Ukrainians to retreat. And the third option is to start actual negotiations. When Mr. Biden, when NATO officials say that in one voice that if Mr. Putin if you use WMDs, you will get an appropriate response from NATO, that actually gives Putin only one choice: to sit down for real at the negotiating table.
Let me ask you, we're not thinking a lot about this, but if Putin somehow comes out of this stronger, if the Ukrainians have to concede on a number of issues, do you think he has greater ambitions, that he could at some point attack the Baltic states or Poland?
We must understand that in his head, Putin is at war not with Ukraine. He's at war with the United States and NATO. He said this more than once. His propagandists have already started to prepare Russian society for an attack on NATO countries. They're constantly talking about this, and this is the preparation of Russian public opinion for this. I'm absolutely convinced that if Putin decides that he has won in Ukraine, this is not going to be the last step, the last war. The next steps will be the Baltic countries.
I've always wanted to ask you this question because I figure you probably can answer it better than almost anybody. What do you think Vladimir Putin is worth in terms of all the money he has been able to take out of Russia personally?
Путин в течение долгого времени
For a long time, Putin was a person that was money-oriented. But as with many elderly criminals, he now has a mission in his head. And that is actually way more scary. His mission, under which he has to show the whole world that he is great, that he is leaving the world a legacy. That's a lot scarier than when he was just gathering money. Right now, I think money is not going to stop him.